Ladies and gentlemen, in today's round of Tata Steel round 3, we saw possibly the craziest, wildest game in 2022 thus far. And we will be getting to it in this recap. But before we do, I'm going to share with you another game that was played for deciding who would lead the standings, or so it would seem, between Jan-Christoph Duda, the player who vanquished Magnus Carlsen in the 2021 World Cup, playing against, you guessed it, Magnus Carlsen. Let's see how the game went. It was e4, e5, not the French, French is losing, e5, knight f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5, a6, so Carlsen is using his preparation from the 2021 World Championship match, while I am mouse slipping all over the place, still getting used to the standing desk here, you see. Knight f6, castles, bishop to e7, rook to e1, this is all standard Spanish theory. And once again, Carlsen sticks to his guns and plays the marshal, and sticks to his guns again with playing rook b8, the system he prepared against Nepo for the 2021 World Championship match. So what is Duda's idea this time? Well, you may recall, if you watched the round 2 recap, the most loyal watchers of this channel will know that Mirzin played c3 and d4 and won against Shuvalova in round 2 of the challenges. But Duda has a different approach in mind. He goes for h3 first, and only then after d6 does he play the move c3. To which Carlsen says, well, let's just play b4 and chip away at that center. So that if white does play a move like d4, this is not what happened in the game, but just to give you an idea, the point would be that black would go captures, 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 and there were so many captures that my stockfish just self-destructed. But because I'm a chess grandmaster, I can tell you in route stockfish on that black has to play d5. And the difference between this position compared to the Mirzin Shuvalova game is that you don't have the pawns on the b file anymore. And that difference favors black because you've got knight b4, a nice outpost for the knight, right? White doesn't have an easy knight c3 to challenge a knight because there's no pawn on b2 to cover it compared to when the pawns are on these squares. And so the differences are in black's favor and black is just fine. And this is why Duda decided to play more slow d3, build up the position more steadily, and if I remember correctly, I believe this is also the way that the match between Nepo and Carlsen went as well, with Carlsen going for some d5 push at some point. I think even it was at this moment, if I remember it correctly. But for this game, Carlsen goes for a slower approach with h6, which, granted, maybe is not objectively as good as d5 according to the engine, but is aiming for a more slower battle, and of course the plan in the Spanish of playing, bishop e3. I'm not sure if this is the best square for the bishop, because in some lines there'll be d5, and the bishop might come under fire to knight d5. But still, the general plan is that black is going to play rook e8, bishop f8. This is all very, very standard for Roy Lopez, where now the rook is able to attack that pawn on e4, if white would have played d4 at some point. Duda plays a very solid move of queen to c2. At a low depth, the engine has a very crazy idea of playing this move of g4, and trying to open up the position with g5. I don't think it really gives an advantage, but if you want to burn your bridges and go all out for the win, then his plan of playing the g5 break is one way to do so. But Duda realizes, well, he still has many years to potentially win a World Championship match against Magnus Carlsen, and so he goes for the more solid queen to c2, bishop to e6. It's funny I said that, actually, because you might have heard the story of Carlsen, saying he's not going to defend his World Championship title against anyone other than Firouzja. So maybe Duda will be, trying to win a World Championship against Firouzja in the future, not Carlsen. But I digress. And also, the game went bishop e6. If white does go bishop a4, I mean bishop d7, and I think it's a question of how white actually increases the pressure, because, when half the queenside has already been liquidated in terms of the pawns, it makes the position a bit more drawish in nature, yes or yes. And the fact computers are already saying bishop b3 is the best move suggests that probably the way Duda played is best after all, to go bishop takes e6, and just out of interest, which way would you take back, with the pawn or with the rook in this case, if you were black? And do remember also, if you are enjoying this video so far, smash that like button, and also subscribe to the channel. Remember, hitting that red subscribe button is the easiest way to improve your chess. So the answer here is that rook takes e6 is the move, because we want to keep our structure more solid, fe6 doesn't make much sense if you don't have like rook f8, knight h5, knight f4 really quickly. Duda plays a move d4, and to be fair, white does get a small advantage out of the opening here. ed4, knight takes d4, forcing the exchange of the knight, and so, inferior to pawn on c7 is a backward and a little bit weak. But it's only one weakness, and for the most part, Carlsen does a pretty good job of neutralizing white's advantage from here. Queen e8 is a very nice move by Carlsen, just saying that a trade of these pawns would make the position very symmetrical and very drawish in nature. So white goes for the move d5 and wants to keep his center forward. Again, it's a very high quality play by both sides. Neither side is really putting a foot wrong at this point. This is what happens like at a top level, if you're playing black and your opponent is playing good moves every move. I mean, you can't win per se. Like, you have to rely on some mistake by the opponent if you're going to win a game of chess. And these guys just aren't making mistakes. So we had rook b2. And this may be the first move where we might say it's not like the top line of the engine. The computer has some very weird idea of playing c5. And basically, letting white take en passant and go, oh, I take en passant, go back to learning the basics of chess. But black's point is that you go rook c7 and rook c8, and somehow, white's just not able to keep that extra pawn in the long term. You can see how these rooks are very passive trying to defend it. And meanwhile, black has a very nice move of knight d7, with the idea of going knight b8 and getting the pawn back. If it wasn't for this, white would just be a pawn up, but here, if white does play cd7, for example, then yeah, rook c2, and when the dust finally settles here, we see that, this just ends up being, knight f1 is the point to hit the rook, otherwise white would be losing in exchange. But two can play at the tactics game. Rook takes f1, king f1, rook e8, and it basically just a drawish position. I mean, yeah, the d6 pawn is isolated, but it's one weakness. It's well defended, so it's going to be a draw between decent level players here. But okay, rook b2, it gives white a little bit more hope, because at least, black hasn't quite solved the problem of the backward c7 pawn, and, if white plays f3, or even the move in the game bishop d4, there is a little bit of pressure. But Carlsen just continues to defend very well. Knight to h5, rook to a1. Maybe queen e8 is slightly more precise here, just to, cover against rook a8 and maybe go f5 as a source of counterplay, which are options that maybe are not quite as effective with the move queen d7 that was played in the game. Because after queen d7, actually, this is maybe where Duda had his one chance to get a big advantage. Because black has two ideas in this position. Well, actually two pawn breaks to give you a bit of a hint as to what it might be. Black either wants to go c5 and liquidate the pawns like this and trade off white's space advantage, or he wants to go f5 and undermine the pawn like this, yeah? So what white should have done is he should have played queen c2 to both cover f5 and cover c5 at the same time. In that case, the weakness is fixed in place. White can go rook to a7, the knight is kind of a bit out of play on h5, and, white would actually have a big advantage. And so when people maybe doubt, like, can Duda really become the world chess champion? I think that when you look at how difficult opponent that Duda is for Magnus and how close he's come to beating him so many times, and he has beaten him in different matches, I would say, I honestly think that Duda has maybe the second or third best chance of all the current generation of beating Carlsen in a match. Not because of playing strength, but because of how difficult he is stylistically for Carlsen. But in any case, the game went queen c3, and this, allows black a little bit more of a lease of life, where Carlsen saw the tactical opportunity of knight f4, which now is threatening knight e2, so that limits white's options a lot compared to... Because if the queen is on c2, you go like bishop e3, and, the knight just is shooed away, yes or yes. But here you don't have that. And so after queen f3, knight g6, now that black has, improved the worst placed piece in the Mark Voretsky style, white is marginally better, but the worst is kind of over for black. And I don't think Carlsen really put a foot wrong. Like, queen a4 is a nice move to either center. White goes queen d3, which... it's a move, I guess. But yeah, now black plays f5. Just very, very precise play by Carlsen. Just making sure that, if ef5, that you've got knight f4. And when the queen moves, you've got knight e2. And it's just horrible for white. So white goes g3 instead to, dominate the knight. This is very basic positional stuff. And at first, computer says white is better. But then if you go deeper, you realize that after this very important move, queen e8... If you don't play queen e8, white probably goes rook c6, piles the pressure, and black is in a lot of trouble. But somehow white is not quite able to harmonize the pieces, because rook c1 is pinning the self-pinning into this, right? But after the game's knight c3, black just goes rook to e1 in this position and just liquidates the pieces, because the general principle is that once you trade off the rooks, the backward pawn isn't anywhere near as much of a weakness. Yes or yes. And the game is ended a draw quite quickly with queen to e8. So the position is basically equal now. Queen b5, queen c8, and white has a microscopic advantage, but once black goes c6 and trades the pawns, it's absolutely nothing. And since the ending would be a dead draw, white offered a draw and it was accepted by Carlsen. So you can see that even though this game ended in a draw, it did have some content, and I think it is a great game for showing why Duda probably has the second best chance of the young generation after Firouzja of taking the title. Of course, there are many other players like Abdusattorov, World Rapid Champion, Gukesh, Pragnananda, who's also playing this tournament. There are a lot of these players, of course, but of the current top players, Duda has a better chance of getting the world title of Carlsen than most of the others who are somewhat older, let's say. So it'll be interesting to see how the next games go, but let's also see the next game, and this one is indeed the potential game of the year so far. And okay, I know it's only January, it's easy to say, but you can let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite game that you have seen from this round. And I believe actually Dubov was actually clearly better to winning at some point in this game, if I remember correctly. The advantage shifted back and forth quite a bit, so let's see how it went. So Dubov didn't play his Catalan he prepared for Magnus in the World Championship match with Nepo, but instead goes for this more slow e4 approach with bishop c4, knight f6, d3, which is a very main line at the top level, like c3, d6, and normally the lines go something like castles, let's say h3. You play h3 only when they castle, so that you're not running into some g5, g4 sort of thing. But this would be a very typical way the position could play out, where black is just going for the dark squared strategy, and then, trades off the bishops and, plays for solid equality in this sort of way. There are also approaches like a6, of course, but then you are also giving out the option of a4, and, you have to be a little bit careful about that queenside expansion. I think it's a little bit harder for black to equalize in these lines compared to the a5 ones. Well, at least it's the opinion of the correspondent senior international master Wolf Morrow, who, of course, has studied his openings even more deeply than me, being a top correspondence player. But Dubov says, well, if h6, a5 is annoying, what if I beat black to the punch and play to move bishop g5, pinning even before black has castled the king? So to that, black plays h6, putting the question to the bishop to h4. And now Vidit plays the move a5 anyway, which, is an interesting alternative to the usual a6, bishop a7. Because usually the bishop goes to a7 just to tuck away and get out of the way of any d4 or b4. But with the a5 approach, black is saying, well, I just stop you playing b4 altogether, yes or yes. And maybe I don't need to play bishop a7, depending on what white does. Well, Dubov goes creative. He says, well, you want to play some funny a5? Well, I'm going to go knight a3 and maybe I'll use this outpost. Or, okay, technically it's not an outpost because you can prepare c6, but it takes a little time to prepare, right? Or the knight can go to c2 and support d4 that way. It's a very creative approach. I'm not sure if it's as good as the castles knight d2 that I showed you before, but it's certainly very Dubov-esque to play creatively. And Vidit says, you know what, if you're going to let me double your pawns, then yeah, I'm going to take the opportunity. And so the game already becomes very unbalanced at this point in time. B takes a3, and now the computer has a very funny idea actually of playing knight e7, to try to go for the bishop, and saying that if white does double the pawns, well, you kind of, almost as Sveshnikov style, you can try to play f5 and hit in the center, or, c6, d5 to take the center. It will lead to very, very interesting play, but it does take a certain courage to actually play this in an actual classical tournament game. It takes great confidence in your, in your ability to assess this correctly and not think that you're just much worse because of the doubled pawns. But anyway, I guess as a Sveshnikov player, I'm very drawn to this kind of thing, but Vidit plays more solidly queen e7, and that's also perfectly fine. His next move, though, I'm not so sure about. He plays this very slow maneuver of knight to b8 and going for knight bd7 in the kind of Breyer style. But I feel like even in a close position, it's asking a little too much. It's almost like, kind of waving the red flag at the bull, and it's like, charge at me, I'm not afraid. But I think it's more sensible just to play the simple move. Well, okay, it's probably not simple to everybody, but this move of a4 is a very interesting idea. And by the way, other moves like bishop e6, g5 castle are also totally fine. But a4 is very interesting in that you're fixing this pawn as a potential weakness. And what if white goes bishop e5 and says, well, thanks for the free pawn? Well, that pawn is not that big of a deal because they still have double pawns, right? But also even moves like g5 and h5 are very interesting, where suddenly you're starting to attack the king. You know, the bishop is not here anymore to support knight takes g5, and, well, I mean, position is very, very complicated. You know, if you go h4, you have moves like bishop g4 and knight h7, and, you know, suddenly you're just going for a big attack on the king like this. Actually, probably knight d7 is technically better to break the pin, but same idea that you are opening up the white king, and it's pretty dangerous. And if white plays d4, well, then you're allowing h4, and, like, it's just very, very complicated. And, okay, if I went any further, the video would probably be way too long, but to give you an idea, it's like, well, basically black is doing okay, but position is super, super unclear. You know, black is up a pawn, but the pawn also gets in the way of the attack. White's also got moves like queen d5 and, you know, continuing to try to push in the center. Like, very, very messy position where all three results are absolutely possible. But black goes knight b8 instead, and white goes for the move d4. A really nice move, by the way, to just open up that center when black is behind in development. And this is why, like, knight b8 is a bit too slow. Now, here the normal move for white, I think, would be just to play rook e1. So that if they go g5, that you don't have knight e4 to grab the pawn, because it's now well defended. But Dubov says, you know what, I'm happy if you play g5, because when you play g5, and this is what happened in the game, well, then your king has no safe spot to go to anymore, because you can't really castle queenside, and if you castle kingside, you have this big gash right in front of your face. Now, computer says, oh, it's a safe pawn sack, position is still equal, but it's very Dubov-esque to get these positions where black has to defend very precisely. We're able to put a lot of piece pressure on them with the initiative, and it pays off because here, Vidit doesn't find the right defense. What he should have done is he should have played knight takes g3, and then after fg3, opening the file for the rook, to play knight b6, hitting the bishop, and it's scary looking, but black can probably survive this. Like, bishop b5, you can always offer a trade of bishops to neutralize the attack. You know, if need be, you can give back the pawn in some cases, let's say, like, take, and, you know, they get the pawn back with d5, but you get your king castled, and at least your king is kind of safe, and, you know, the position is basically equal after, you know, after this sequence. You know, I can grab a pawn, but you end up getting enough compensation because of white's bad structure and stuff. So that would be the right way to play it, but Vidit goes f5 and decides to light the board on fire, Mikhail Tal style. Unfortunately, after d5, the problem is that, you know, maybe black is playing like an arsonist, but he is the one who is getting burned. Rook f to e1, and suddenly, you know, there are some problems down at e-file when your rook is opposite the queen and the king. And you can't castle because the bishop is covering it, so black had to take on g3. This is what happened in the game. Takes pawn to e4, defending the pawn f5. And now white continues to just keep attacking. g4 is a really great move by Dubov to force open that king side. Of course, black can't take the knight yet because the queen and king are in the way. Only move to keep that pawn on e4 well defended is knight to c5. Okay, knight f6 technically, but it's not as good as knight c5. Because after gf5, it's important that you keep the b7 pawn defended, yes or yes. So after knight c5, white instead plays knight d4. You know, stakes are continuing to raise. And interesting enough, even though I had thought previously that white had a big advantage here, and this is what the engines were saying at a low depth at first, actually the position is probably still holding for black, but it's definitely very, very complex. And if black makes one slip here, he could very easily lose the game, right? In fact, the position is so crazy that even my stockfish is protesting at having to analyze such insanity. But there's only one move for white to keep up the momentum here. And that move is Rook takes b7. So, is this gets to elo? No, the answer is that if black goes knight takes b7, we go bishop to b5. At first I thought knight f5, rook e4 was the idea, but black has rook e5 to save the queen. So it's kind of important to go bishop b5 check. So that if king f7, you can take the bishop. Or if you play bishop d7, then rook e4, and white actually does win the queen after all in this case. And the king is way too open in the center, yes or yes. So black goes rook f6, another really, really great move. I mean, you can see that these guys, like, they're playing as well as the computer at this point, in a very complex position. And probably here, white's best shot is to play a move like rook b5, say, okay, I don't have a forced win, but let's just keep up that pressure. Provoke a move like c6, so this pawn becomes a bit weak. Apparently black is still surviving. Like, if you play queen c7, you're still, able to hold everything. But, white's got some pressure, and definitely it's easier to play white because black's king is in the open center. And it's not like black has an extra pawn to kind of compensate, right? So very, very complex position in that regard. But that's not how the game played out, actually. Instead, after rook f6, white played to insist on the exchange sack with queen at b1. And, okay, I think it's also a playable continuation. Definitely putting a lot of pressure on black here as well. But it does turn out black has enough resources to survive after rook d8. Knight f5. So this is what happened in the game. Take the pawn on e4. So white gets a pawn back for the exchange. But black goes rook d1, and that is very important, by the way, because rook e5, queen c6 would actually be winning for white with the different mating threats. But by playing rook d1 and only then playing rook e5, the difference is now after queen c6 that black has the very important extra option of king to d8 here. Avoiding like the king f8, queen g6 kind of tricks and this sort of thing. So at this point, actually, after queen 8, king d7, probably what white should do in this position is to kind of just accept that the game is going to end in a draw. Like queen c8. This is what happened in the game where white starts giving some checks. If king f7, you'd go bishop c4 and keep the attack going that way. Queen h8, king f5, and it's at this point that basically the game is effectively decided. And, when you've got this attack going for so long, it's very natural to feel like, oh, I've got to mate the guy somehow. But, if the opponent defends very well and doesn't make any mistakes, you just got to accept that, okay, you passed the 40 question, multiple question test. So, alright, you get a pass. We're going to agree a draw. And the way in which white could have done that here, and I'm pretty sure that Dubov saw this and just thought he was winning another way, is the move queen c8 is the key. So it's important to know that black can't take that rook with the king because queen to g4 and very beautiful Dubov style mate with queen c4. And I believe it's called the epaulette mate, right? Because the rook and queen are sort of like, the epaulettes, keeping the head in place to be sliced off or, guillotined. But anyway, of course, black is not forced to take the rook with the king. He can move the king back, say king g6, queen g8, and, you're just going to oscillate between these squares like king f6, queen to h8, king f5, queen c8, and you have this funny kind of repetition. Obviously, black can't block with queen g7, because then you just take, and black just loses a rook, which is no good. So black also has to accept the draw, or he's going to lose. But in the battle of who is going to refuse to accept the draw first, well, Dubov won this battle by playing f3, and unfortunately by winning the battle, you lose the war. Red rook takes e4, and yeah, I'm honestly not sure what Dubov overlooked at this point. Maybe he genuinely didn't see the queen c8 in this mating concept earlier, because it is something that you have to kind of have a bit of an open mind to kind of see such a possibility, but after this, yeah, it turns out the king is just quite safe on e4, that you can kind of run and use the opponent's pawns as a shield, so queen a8, and unfortunately queen f3 is not mate, because queen king d2 and the king runs away. In the game after bishop c6, we had queen to e5 check, g3, and now g4 is just kind of a nice move to prepare this sort of mate, and the checks just peter out quite quickly. Queen f2, you can even play queen e2 and be up the exchange. The computer says king c1 is forced mate in 10, but anyway, Dubov resigned in this position, and this allowed Vidit to actually take the outright lead in the tournament with a score of 2.5 out of 3, as he had beaten Shanklin in round 1, and he drew with some guy in round 2 I already forgot, but yeah, who remembers the draws? We only remember the glorious wins. Anyway, this was a pretty fun game. Definitely, I can see why I said it was possibly one of the best games of 2022 so far. But let's look at some of the others. The game between Caruana and Shanklin was a long game, but it wasn't really one where either side had any major winning chances. Like, it was just a very sort of standard Berlin, like, this all very normal theory, and, okay, Caruana played this unusual b3, hoping to maybe catch out his opponent, but Shanklin, he recently did a repertoire course on the Berlin for Chessable, so, like, it'd be a bit embarrassing if he, lost to his own repertoire in that sense. But, like, you can sort of see, like, black is just rock solid, no real weaknesses. Maybe some of these moves not the most precise. Maybe white can try to claim he's got some tiny edge, but it never really amounted to anything special, and the game just ended in a fairly boring draw. So I'm not going to waste more time on it. Let's get to the more bloody games where the blood is on the board, as it were, because that is the title of the video after all. And so next on that list we have Jordan van Foreest winning against Pragnananda, and Foreest is sort of like the, let's say, he's like the spectator's favourite at the moment, not just because he's the defending champion, but also because he has had 2 wins and 1 loss, which we all know is better than 2 draws and 1 win from the spectator perspective of more fun games. And this also happens to be Pragnananda's first loss of the tournament as well, after drawing the first 2 games of high-rate players like Geary and so on. So at knight f3, knight c6, and now Van Foreest comes up with a move that I used to call the beginner's move. It's known as the Bowdler Attack, or at least it's the Bowdler Attack if you play move earlier. He plays bishop to c4. And at first, like, if you didn't know the range of players, you would think I was talking game between like a 1200 and maybe another 1200 or something. But no, that's not the case. So after e6, white castles, and the way I normally play this as black is I like to go for just some a6 and just go b5 and just kick the bishop. And the idea of that, by the way, is that if white goes a4, then you go d5 and, well, white doesn't get this bishop b5 idea that you see in the game because we stopped with a6. But it looks like Van Foreest might have done a little bit of homework into this and realized that it's actually very interesting to play to move rook e1 in this position, with the idea that if black goes b5, then it might actually be a little bit too early because of bishop f1 and c3 d4. And white can try to make the argument he's got some sort of improved Rossolimo or Moscow system. And your computer actually thinks white is better after black has played b5. So it's a very interesting point. And maybe the bishop c4 move is maybe not as stupid as I had previously assumed. So after e6 castles, Pragnananda plays the move of d5, which is the first line of machine. And I mean, if white has to give up the center, it sort of makes sense that there's no way in a million years that white is going to be better. But Van Foreest comes up with his bishop b5. Very original approach. Playing it almost like kind of Budapest gambit reversed. Where you sack the pawn, but, your knight gets to e5, or maybe Fajarish reversed is maybe the better comparison. But, where black has played e6, shut in the bishop, so it's a little bit different. Knight e7 is one way to defend the knight, but Prague decides to go for queen c7 instead. And then after take, bishop c4, I mean, I don't think white is objectively better in this position, but he definitely has full compensation based on the fact that black does have a lot of double pawns in his structure and is a little behind in development, so it's probably enough to work with at least. And just so you know, I'm not planning to cover the Challengers games in this video because we have so much great content with the Masters games that it would be like an over 2-hour video if I cover the Challengers games as well. Probably my plan there is going to be to cover the Challengers games round 3 and 4 like on the rest day and do a video then. Because, I mean, you guys probably came more for, like, Carlsen, Dubov, and, Geary and these sort of players rather than, the Challengers guys. So, anyway, black goes bishop to d6. Develop with tempo, can't be bad. White goes king to h1, kind of anticipating bishop h2. Actually, it's very interesting, like, for the theoreticians, maybe it's worth noting that actually sacking a second pawn is a very interesting idea in this position. Okay, maybe it's not technically a pawn sack, because, like, f5, you've got queen h5, or knight f6, you got g3 trapping the bishop. But it's kind of an interesting point that even when you trade off this doubled pawn, you've still got good compensation because you're a lead in development. And that's something that's definitely an eye-opener for me, at least. And it's also an eye-opener for Stockfish, because Stockfish is now constantly refusing to load properly. So let me just whip it in the line right now. Okay, I gave Stockfish the good old cattle prod, so now let's continue with the game. We had king to h1, anticipating bishop h2, yes or yes. Black goes knight f6, and, Pragnananda, in despite of probably being surprised at this point, continues to play very good moves. e5 also, really great move to free the bishop and defend the extra pawn. And at this point, I mean, yeah, this is why, like, moves like queen e2 and rook e1 are not going to get the pawn back. So rather than, saying, oh, the pawn is doubled, let's try to win it, it's better to kind of let bygones be bygones and play it in the gambit style, which Van Foreest did with the move f3. d3 is also possible, but f3 is kind of nice because you're also activating the queen with a recapture, the rook gets active, and, you still get d3 and this sort of thing. I think the position is probably objectively equal, but I feel like it's somehow much easier to play white here. And that might be evidenced by the fact that Prague made his first little mistake, where he kind of made a sort of bailout move that just didn't really work that well. A move like king h8, though, definitely is not the world's easiest move to play, but it does get out of the pin, and it does mean that at least bishop g5 doesn't have the same sting to it, because now you go knight g8 and go f5, and the bishop kind of looks a little bit stupid in that case. Yes or yes. So king h8 is a very deep prophylaxis. Of course, white can try other moves. You know, probably bishop d2 is maybe a better square for the bishop by comparison. But ultimately, position is probably objectively equal. I mean, even here, the plan of, well, maybe knight j is a little bit slow if the bishop's not on g5, but the computer points out a very interesting idea like e4, and just giving back the pawn to catch up in development and kind of neutralize the white initiative this way. In any case, it's a fun position, you know, the game goes on from here, but probably equality is the right assessment. But Pragg goes bishop e6, saying, okay, my structure is absolutely atrocious, but at least I sort of neutralize some of your piece pressure. But I do think it's slightly too big a price to pay, and I do think that while black's position is still playable, definitely the momentum is with white's. And despite being a pawn down, white is really not risking anything whatsoever. Because, I mean, how are you going to use these sort of two sets of double pawns to create a pass pawn? Actually, if you look at the image, it almost looks like some kind of like Death Star or something, or, you know, some ship, you know, with the, you know, turrets, but not kind of like a very effective ship, kind of like, you know, the Millennium Falcon was dragged out of, you know, the woodwork, but it's, you know, but it's not working anymore. In any case, black played queen to d7. Apparently rook b8 first, a bit more precise to hit the pawn. And yeah, now white plays bishop f6, which is a very interesting decision, let's say. I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with it, because I think gf6 is improving the pawn structure. I probably would have been a little more patient and played a move like queen to e2, and, you know, I get that you're not, like, winning a pawn back by force, but I think you can just play very patiently. Your moves like, let's say, rook f3, just build up on the f file. Maybe your bishop can come around to attack this pawn, or, you know, put the knight on e4. I think, you know, it definitely pays to be a bit patient in this kind of position, and computer does think white has a pretty nice advantage here. Whereas after bishop f6, the play is a lot more spicy, but I think that black is doing okay if he plays it correctly. Admittedly, he didn't play it correctly in the game, though. The right way to play, I think, is just to play bishop to e7, because the bishop might be a bad bishop, but it's also a very good defender, right? And I think that if you play rook f7, rook f8, you know, to be fair, black is doing a pretty decent job of defending his weaknesses, so I think a position would be pretty close to equal once black kind of gets his pieces coordinated like this. So in any case, this would probably have led to, you know, a more balanced result, but instead we had to move f5, and I mean, f5 is not a decisive mistake, but it's, I think, a slight inaccuracy to let white get this sort of exchange and, you know, be able to get the pawn back. Because if white does get the pawn back, I mean, the pawn structure is not great for black here. Probably the best move here is to go king h8 and just, you know, at least make sure queen g3 doesn't come with a check as such. And if white does play queen e2 to just get the pawn back, at first it looks like it's just absolutely horrible. I mean, it's quite possible maybe Pragnananda just took one look and thought, well, I just can't do this simply. But actually to move c4, it kind of makes things not so simple. And suddenly white's structure is not so great either. The idea of luring the pawn is so you can play e4 and kind of keep a very nice pawn chain. Of course, white's not going to, you know, allow this if he has, you know, any sensibility. But yeah, you go queen e5 instead. And, you know, this sort of ending, I mean, white is a bit better, yeah. But white also has a weak pawn to target. And I think that black can get his pieces active enough, say with rook e8 and rook d8, that, you know, probably black can hold this if he continues to play precisely. You know, for example, if we take rook fe1, yeah, white can try to grab a pawn like rook e6, but you also see that black's rook is also very active. You're threatening a back rank mate, but you've also got rook d2. So ultimately all the pawns will just get hoovered off, and, you know, it'll just be a draw probably from there, one way or the other. But instead we have the move f4. And okay, the idea of f4 is he wants to try and defend the pawn, but you're also giving rook e4, which is not so nice. Game did go on for a long time, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit past this point, unless there's some big opportunity, but, you know, black is trying to resolve the problem of his bad structure by trading some pieces, because the dual pawns are less of a problem when the rooks are off the board, yes or yes. White played queen to e2, trying to keep up the pressure and kind of force black's hand. Rook e4, queen g4, nice little intermezzo to chase the king away, and, you know, make him choose a side, as it were. Actually, probably it's better to play king f7, even though it makes the king more open. It kind of helps to defend some of the weaknesses. It's probably why this is better. But in the game, black goes king h8, and I don't think this is quite as precise. Because after rook e4, like, the king is suddenly cut off, which could be a problem down the line in an endgame. And also to move f3 by Pragnananda, like I'm guessing probably there was some element of time pressure, because I think he just felt like if he sat on this position that white would find some way to break through. But it turns out black's position is actually surprisingly resilient, that, for example, if you play queen f8 and, you have ideas like queen f6 and rook g5, and, you're actually getting some real counterplay. Also, if the queen does go to h6, moves like f3, that would become a big idea. So if white covers that with queen f3, I mean, you could also play, a move like a5 or a move like queen h6, and I mean, you have got counterplay here as black. It's not like you're just waiting, that the pawn just ducks in a line waiting to be shot down or something. So probably this way would allow black to stay in the game. White is still better, but it's not winning by any means. But f3 is a little bit kind of self-destructive, I think. And after f3, queen to f8, probably the simplest move here is just to play king g2 and just to defend the pawn, right? And I'm trying to figure out maybe what Van Vries didn't like about this. Maybe he didn't like queen h6, and, the counterplay might look a bit annoying at first. But it turns out there's a very nice move of queen h4, and somehow the black attack, as it were, just doesn't really lead anywhere. Like, rook g5, king f2, there's no follow-up check. Rook h5, you're going to have queen d8 with a check, and if queen f2, then d2, then yeah, just queen f2. Rook g5, you got rook g4, which is a very important point to consolidate, and, equal material, but black has all isolated pawns. I mean, in terms of worst pawn structure all time, this one's definitely a contender for black, but yeah, white should win this. In the game, white goes queen to g3, and, I guess wanting to transform this way, and, well, to be fair, it's also completely winning. So maybe that's the reason why Van Vries didn't play it, because the way he played it is maybe even better. And yeah, once we get to this kind of rook ending, like rook g4, and, once the queens get traded with queen to h4, which is not the engine's first line, but I think it's good enough to win, then yeah, I think this ending is just completely lost for black. By the way, if black does play a move like rook takes f3 in this position, then I think white will just take, and, black is just losing all these weaknesses, and, it's not just that you're going to be up a pawn once two of these guys fall, but also your king is going to get very active and be a lot more active than the counterpart. Again, if black had the king on f7 instead, by comparison, you go king e7, king d6, and probably you hold the draw as black. But here, that, of course, is not available in time. And I think, yeah, I mean, the rook ending I don't think really requires a super deep analysis, right? I mean, white is just... It's going to take some time, but eventually it's going to maneuver, and somehow black is not going to be able to defend a litany of weaknesses. Like if king h8, the rook gets in this way, yeah, but if rook f4 is in the game, then yeah, king f2, rook f7, rook g5, and white is just going to keep maneuvering like rook e1, rook e4, and, attack the weaknesses this way. Which is so annoying that actually Prague decided to go c4 and, just sack a pawn for counterplay. But it still wasn't enough, and, around this point, white was able to convert it to a win. Like, it's not just that white is up a pawn, but also white just has better coordination and still the better pawn structure, because all these guys are still isolated. And, I mean, I'll just show the final moves quickly. I'm not going to analyze it, but just to play the final moves. Rook e5, rook g5, b4, and, if rook g2, you can always defend it, right? It's not a big deal. Rook g1, b5, c5, so white is just pushing those pawns forward. Rook d1, king e4. And yeah, we have this transformation where black gets his pawn back, but unfortunately for him, the move b6, we see here that the passed pawn is just way too strong. Like rook b4, rook b3 ensures that the pawn will be shepherded home to glory, and after rook c2, rook b3, same problem, black can't get his rook to stop the pawn in time. So c4, rook b1, c3, b7, and okay, rook b2 is obviously not in time because white is queening and covering the promotion square at the end. So rook e2, king d4, c2, rook g1, and queen's next move. So Pragnananda finally resigned here. So I think you'll agree this is a pretty fun game. Definitely a lot of instructional value in terms of, seeing a kind of long-term positional pawn sack play out and how black had so many weaknesses. He just wasn't able to cover them all at once in the end after, not finding the best way to defend it. So let's see how our next game went. And this next game between Giri and Mamedrav was actually ended up being a pretty short draw, but it's a very good example of the depth of opening preparation that that the top players go into, because basically if you just turn on the engine at low depth, it'll say that white was better the whole time. But if you go deeper, you kind of realize that actually white's edge is not as big as the machine claims. So this approach of delaying knight c3 against the semi-Slav is a way to try to set some problems, saying that, for example, if black were to, let's say, play dc4 and b5, it's just not as effective when white hasn't played knight c3 yet, because then when you do play a move like a4, for example, you know, they don't have the move b4 to attack your knight, which is really the fulcrum of black's counterplay with c5. So it's almost like you're kind of 2 tempi ahead on a normal Moran, because you haven't had to play knight c3 and then backward knight to a1, knight to b1, yes or yes. So realizing that, Mamedyarov plays bishop e7 first, and waits for white to go knight c3, and then plays the move dc4 and b5. Which is not an absolutely perfect version, by the way, because you would prefer the bishop to be on d6 in such a position to try to support e4, e5 as a central break. But still, Mamedyarov came prepared and showed that even with the bishop not being on a perfect square, that black's position is still very, very solid. Giri played a very principled way with e4, it's playing in the center, rook c8, and, e5, knight d5 kind of just gives black a nice square for the knight. So instead, Giri goes a3, and actually, a3 has a very, very creative idea that if black plays the move ba3, which is probably the move that Sharks should have played, white's idea is not to play ba3 and give black easy equality with c5 hitting in the center, but instead to play against the c5 break with b4, which at first glance looks like a completely, suicide chess kind of move, but the point is after bishop b4 and bishop to a3, you actually get very decent compensation here as white. Because let's say black takes, it's not that easy for black to get in c5 in a good version. Because, his king is still in the center, and, well, if white is able to keep some position like e5 and put an eye on c5, black's queenside is so passive after that. Such that actually the best move black might, in fact, be to play the move c5 here. And, let white kind of get the pawn back, as it were. Let white play rook a7 if he wants to, but then you say that, okay, I can, move the bishop, get castled, and kind of consolidate this way. Position is still quite messy, but probably black should be able to defend it. But black goes c5 instead, and this is an approach that the computer really does not like at all, and this is kind of the reason why I decided to show this game. Because white goes knight takes c5, knight takes c5, dc5, bishop c5, and so in playing c5, Shark is basically, well, you could say letting white play the move a takes b4, and, because of bishop b4, rook a7, white is kind of winning a pawn. Actually, if bishop b4, even queen a4 might be a move as well. And yeah, now that I gave Stockfish the cattle prod stop misbehaving, it indeed confirms that, yeah, bishop b4, just, yeah, queen a4 is just winning a piece. Because after queen d7, you've got bishop b5, or even queen b4, and you are, taking this bishop at the end, which is an important tactical point. But black goes bishop b6, and okay, black is down a pawn, but it's also a double pawn. And here is where Giri maybe shows one of his kind of old weaknesses of, getting the much better position, but not having the, let's say, calculation strength to convert it into the win. And so, I also have a similar weakness of, my calculation being not as good as my intuition. So I kind of relate. But here I think white should either play to move e5. This is the more direct approach, and, Indran is saying, go knight g5 and just kill the guy in the center. Or I guess you're killing him on the king side, but if h6 knight e4, then I guess you're kind of killing him in the center with, knight d6 and stuff coming. Or even queen g4, just develop and attack. If you gave this position to Paul Morphy, I think he would play this in a heartbeat. But also even a move like queen e2 as well, I was thinking, I didn't quite get why Giri didn't just play this and just have a solid extra pawn. White is definitely a lot better here as well. After castles and, say, bishop d2 or e5 or something. There are a lot of decent moves. Bishop b5 struck me as a bit of a weird move in a certain sense. I get that, the king is moving to f8 and, you lose the right to castle. But, how are you going to deal with the e-pawn is kind of the question. And yeah, in the rest of the game, somehow I didn't really manage to get much of an advantage from here. So ultimately, the game concluded with queen d8, which, again, probably not the best move. Maybe keeping the queens on might have given more chances to press. But Giri decided to go for the safe approach, and, well, unfortunately, the safe approach just wasn't really giving me anything special. Black has got the pawn back. And computer is saying bishop c5 is the last chance for an advantage, but even then it feels like black is kind of out of the woods somehow. But after take, knight e5, g5, and rook a7, somewhat mysteriously a draw was agreed. At first I didn't get it, because I just thought, well, white has still got some initiative, but actually after bishop g6 only move, I mean, it's not that easy to actually break black's position, because, I mean, rook b7 just leads nowhere after knight d5, yeah? At least as far as I can tell. And yeah, if you play bishop c4 instead, you've got moves such as rook g8 or rook d4, and black is kind of, untangling, and in a sense, white does have the doubled b-pawns after all, so structurally it's kind of hard to push with that. So I guess that's the reason why the game ended in a draw, and okay, it was a bit of a weird game where, Maradrov completely screwed up the opening and Giri completely screwed up after the opening, so maybe a draw is the fair result in that sense. So short game, but still one with some content. Guys, it's really crazy to me that we are 45 minutes in, and we still have 2 decisive games from this tournament to cover. But, I like to get through all of the games. I show you all of the highlights from the round. And, well, it also helps build up the watch hours. I've heard this rumor that when you get to 4,000 plus watch hours, then the channel becomes monetized. And when it becomes monetized, you start getting all these amazing deals coming in. And then one day you wake up to find you have 500k subscribers and a 6-figure sponsorship contract. Okay, I am jesting a little bit, but let's get into the game between Esipenko against Karyakin, the new rising Russian prodigy, against the former youngest grandmaster in the world of all time. Well, at least until Abhimanyu Mishra broke the record, earlier in 2021. But anyway, come on, Stockfish, stop misbehaving. I'll give you the cattle prod. Zzz. Okay, now we've given Stockfish the cattle prod. Or more precisely, 5 cattle prods. We are ready to roll. So Esipenko actually also plays modern Italian like Dubov, except he doesn't play it like Dubov because he plays it with c3 and knight f6 d3, and then he doesn't go for the bishop g5 style move like Daniel Dubov did against Vidit. Okay, it was a little bit different because, white played castles instead, but similar idea. Well, he decides to go for castles in this position. Actually, I just realized, actually was in that position that we had bishop g5 and Dubov Vidit. See, this is what happens when it's a hot day. You already forget what you covered earlier in the video. But let's continue on. Castles h6, and yeah, like I said before, don't play h3 too early or g5, g4 is basically going to mate you. So Esipenko knows this and he plays rook e1, and only after black castles now he plays the move h3. And as I mentioned before, a5 is kind of the main line at a top level, but a6 was Karyakin's preference. Waiting for white to play a4 and only then playing the move of a5. And, well, it's a very interesting approach, saying that, on the one hand, white has an extra tempo with the move a4, but on the other hand, maybe that also makes the structure a little bit flexible for white. In the sense of, like, for example, if white goes d4, which finally that was actually what he did in the game, well, then black can bring the bishop back and say, well, at some moment, maybe I can take the pawn and then use that b4 outpost for the knight. So a very deep positional point, and this is one reason why the modern Italian is a very complex opening, a lot of tricky move orders, but if you kind of understand the position well, you can figure it out. And Esipenko played, I think, a very nice move here in bishop to b3, just preparing to kind of improve the placement of the bishop to defend the center, like this has happened in the game. Because let's say if white goes bishop to e3 and just plays like a more normal developing move, and okay, I get that knight e4 is a move, but d5 is then somehow the tactics just work for white. Because, yeah, you're going like bishop e6, and then you're hitting the knight, and somehow it's just bad for black, because he's losing a piece. But if you go bishop e3, you give black the option to play e takes d4, and again, kind of like the Merzen Shuvalova game from the previous round, to go d5, but because you're hitting the bishop, white doesn't have the option of e5 in a good version. So you kind of force this kind of a weird, like, IQP where black also has his square for the knight, bishop e6, and white is just not really better at the end of the day. I mean, if white goes bishop d5 and just plays very, very radically, I mean, black has still got the b4 square for the knight, so there's no real reason, I think, for black to be objectively worse with the, the bishop in hand, as it were. But the game saw bishop b3, rook e8, bishop c2. And the thing of bishop c8 is that if white gets time to go bishop e3, knight a3, and sort of develop, then white is just going to be better, and that's kind of what happened in the game. So I think this may have been a good moment to consider a move like ed4, and then knight to b4, where, you give up the center a bit, but you also are able to get the bishop pair, because bishop b3 hangs the pawn, and after knight c3, the position is probably close to equal. Maybe white has some tiny edge because of the extra space, but I think after c6, black would be quite solid. The move Kayakin played with bishop d7 is the top line of the engine, though, so, I think it's hard to criticize. White could go bishop e3, but maybe he didn't want to allow, some ed4 and some knight e4 kind of thing. Maybe this is what he didn't like. Because if white has to go bishop d4, it definitely makes this look less appealing, even if computer says you can still fight for an edge with white. But this is something for the theoreticians, or I should say my fellow theoreticians, to explore more deeply. Well, the game saw knight a3. I mean, putting the knight here can't be bad, yeah. And also, it does kind of force black to find the right move here, or he's going to suffer the way he did in the game. It's like, that'll teach you for trashing Dubov after the Carlsen-Nepo World Championship match. So what black should really do here is play the move ed4. And it looks super anti-positional at first, but the point is that you want to go d5. And the reason d5 is important is so that you can meet e5 with knight e4. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying this is just a pawn blunder, Max. But actually, the point is that if you take, it's actually very, very nice for black. Not just because black gets the bishop pair, but also this rook is very awkwardly placed. And I mean, if black is able to take the pawn, he's just better with the bishop pair. Yes or yes. But rook f4 is also like such an ugly square for the rook. In fact, after queen e7, you're probably going to have to sacrifice the exchange with g5, and maybe it's, white can somehow make it work in terms of not just being a down exchange for nothing, but it's not great either, right? And of course, white's not forced to take, like white would just keep the tension, but in general, if black is able to keep that on e4, then it can hardly be worse, right? But instead, black goes queen c8, kind of missing the critical moment, which is a common weakness I've noticed at Kayakin, so he sometimes is a little too reliant on his preparation in the sense that he might not look at the line deeply enough, or if the opponent plays some tricky alternative, he doesn't see the difference. And okay, it is a very hard thing to do, but like we are talking very high standard at this 2743 plus rating that he's at. So white goes knight b5. I like knight a4 personally, just to, kick that bishop away. Would just appeal to me more, but knight b5 also a move, and actually, and again, we have this funny sequence with knight a7. And now white doesn't decide to keep the tension when we move like queen to d3, but he goes back and we have this, funny repetition. Again, there's a second chance to go knight c4, but he decides to do it this way. And okay, if you play knight a3, you're basically making a draw, and white is better, so don't make the draw, but instead play c4, which is what Esipenko did, so that if black takes, we can take back with the a-pawn, and then our rook developed without needing to move. A little bit of a magic trick with the double pawns that were, and it is actually what happened in the game. I'm curious to see actually whether there was a better move in this position. I mean, one idea would be to play knight c6 and go knight b4, but I'm not sure if it works that well in this particular position. I mean, the other option is to go ed4 and try to trade this way, but, well, it's kind of a similar thing happens in the game with knight b5, ab5. Now, black does indeed play ed4, and, well, Kayakin tries to solve his problems by quite direct means, playing the move c6. But c6 is also a move that, even though it's probably the best move to at least grab some kind of space, it does come at a cost. And what is that cost? Well, that cost is that the pawn on d6 is now very exposed. The other cost is I now have to cattle prod Stockfish one more time. So here white has a couple of different ways to get at this pawn on d6. In the game, white went bishop to f4. The computer, for some reason, is drawn to the idea of knight f3, but I can sort of get why Esipenko might not have wanted to allow d5 and, these sort of tricks to, try and free the position tactically. Apparently you can still go e5 and you're still better here, but again, not, I think, the most obvious thing in the world from a human perspective. From a human perspective, it's way more natural to develop a new piece into the game and make sure all the pieces are coordinated like this. But it does give black some options, and one of these is to go queen a6, which is a very nice resource found by Kayakin. I think without this resource, probably black is just clearly worse, but now the point is that in the game after bishop d6, queen a7, that suddenly, the pin is actually pretty annoying, because you can't move that knight because bishop f2, yes or yes. So you're pretty much forced to go c5, which is what happened in the game. Take, take, take. And now not a capture, but the move queen to d3, and I mean, you could argue that there are other moves like queen d2, knight b3, or some other moves, but in general, the nature of the position is not overly affected by the decision here. But at this point, this is where Kayakin starts to make some mistakes. Possibly he was getting a little lower on time, and this might have affected his decision-making a little bit. Because the move g6 just somehow... I mean, yeah, the idea is you're stopping some pin here, but it's not really a threat, and you're also kind of weakening the king a bit in the long term, which is not great. Probably a more unpleasant move by comparison would be queen d6. Just pin this. Maybe go for c5, just trade the queens and just try to liquidate everything for a draw. That I think would have been a more supportive approach for black to try to steer the game closer to equality. White is still a little better, but the game goes on, of course. Black goes g6, but yeah, now white goes rook a to d1. I actually like rook a to c1 better, just so you're kind of discovering attack on the queen and hitting the weakness, but okay, rook a d1 was played in the game. And black in turn decides to play the move of a4 just to stop that aforementioned idea of the bishop coming to b3 and trying to hit some of the weaknesses. White goes queen e3, hitting this, so the players are continuing to play quite well. But now black does have a difficult defensive decision, because whichever way you defend this h6 pawn, there's going to be a bit of a problem as such. And this is kind of why the best bet might actually be to ignore the attack on the pawn and counterattack with rook a b8. Which I get, yeah, it requires certain nerves of steel to realize that, you know, you're not just getting murdered after queen h6 and rook b2, and, well, you also have to realize that white isn't just winning a pawn for free, because bishop a4, rook a4 is, you know, somehow keeping the parity in this case. And, you know, this would be, you know, about equal according to computer. So, well, actually, I will show the line because it's kind of instructive. That is, if bishop c2, the black can now play even, let's say, rook takes c2. Like, this if he just wants to force a draw directly with, you know, take and then after rook d7, yeah, you get a perpetual check with queen g3, queen e1, etc. So, anyway, that's kind of how the game could play out. But of course, it's true, white is not forced to play all these lines. There are other attacking moves, like e5 is one idea. Queen f3 even is another possible idea. So, there are a lot of lines that black has to be ready for, but this is sort of the way in which black had to play. He had to play for the counter-attack, because trying to defend passively is just not really going to work somehow when you've got this kind of momentum with these pawns and the pieces moving forward. Like, for example, if king h7, white would go e5, and, you know, queen f3, and you sort of see now why, like, there are some problems, that this pawn is under fire. You know, I just got moves like h4, h5, and e6 just to rip open the black king's pawn cover. So it's kind of probably even worse than maybe it looks at first sight. In the game, Kayakin tries to defend with queen g5, offering a trade of queens, and of course, if white was forced to trade, then black would be kind of doing alright. Computer says queen a3, but this is a very, very hard move to play, I think, in a game, because the natural focus is to attack on the king's side and move majority forward. So in that sense, f4 is a very human move to get things moving along, even if computer doesn't totally agree with it. So queen to h4 was played, knight to f3, and, well, this was Esipenko's idea to go for this endgame with the move knight to e5. You know, about this move, like, threats like bishop h3 would kind of be a pain in the neck. But now white's got this ending where, you know, white has some pressure, and this is where Kayakin made his fatal blunder, and maybe I spent too much time on this game, but I just found it very interesting, not just from the fact that white won, but there are a lot of kind of interesting strategic decisions that definitely even grandmasters can learn something from. Well, I know I'm learning something from going through it. So the right decision for black here, I believe, is just to play rook to e7, just defend the bishop, and maybe Kayakin was concerned about something like rook e6, d6 maybe, trying to attack the pawn and the knight. But after king g7, it turns out knight c6 is actually not as good as it looks at first. The point is that black can just take, and now there's a very nice little tactical trick in the move knight d5, using the pin on the pawn to basically get the pawn back. So if you play something like rook f3 trying to defend the f-pawn, then black hits the other way with knight b4. And then after, you know, the 1-2-3 punch, finally, you know, black takes the pawn back and, well, it's basically a draw, though you could say black has a better side of equality if you want to be really technical. But yeah, this is why rook e7 was kind of the move to play, and I think that Kayakin, I don't think he missed rook e7, but I think he just miscalculated something here. Because he thought he could sack a piece with rook eb8 and say that, well, if white takes, and this is what happened in the game, that black's a-pawn gives him enough counterplay to hold. Unfortunately, that doesn't turn out to be the case, because there is a very specific sequence, or, well, technically two specific sequences that win. The computer's way is to go bishop d3, and say that if a3, you go bishop c4, and, you know, you basically give back the the piece, but say that this kind of position after like bishop f7, bishop takes a2, you basically say that this is winning for white. But you have to see, well, okay, you do have rook g3, I guess, and okay, it does kind of make sense that black's pigs on the 7th rank aren't actually devouring anything after all. But the way the Henko played is also good enough. He played rook to e2 in the game, just defending the bishop, and yeah, it's not obvious to me what exactly Kayakin overlooked here. Because after rook d1, the pawn is just simply stopped in its tracks. a2, rook a1, and I mean, I don't know. Was he trying to go rook b8 and rook b1? I mean, it doesn't really work because you can even just block it, for example. So, I don't know what Kayakin missed. It's a very weird kind of oversight to my mind. But the game ultimately concluded c5, king f2, rook a3, king to e1, c4, king to d2. So white is making sure the king gets in the game and that this rook is kicked out of the way. After rook g3, king c1, c3. Well, now the time control is reached, and after king d1, h5, e5, the reason that Kayakin resigned is that white is simply going to go bishop e4, defending this pawn, and also, well, this idea of king d1, making sure the rook is defended. And then next move, white will just take this pawn, and white has a piece up for nothing. So this is why Kayakin resigned, and I think you'll agree that this was a very interesting game that had a lot of interesting strategic decisions as well as some tactical melees. And so definitely a game that, like I said, I think player of any level could learn from even a beginner to grandmaster. You'll get something out of this game. So there's one more game here between Grandelius against Report, and this was actually a game that Report managed to win. Now I do realize, we hit the hour point, so let's make this quick. So it's e4, c5, and with this win, by the way, Report moved to 2 out of 3, half a point off the lead. There's like this massive traffic jam of players on 2 out of 3 at the moment. And Report played his Taimanov, which is kind of one of his preferred defenses, to e4. He likes to go a little bit against the grain compared to the other top players playing like their Berlins or their Neidorfs or Marshalls or whatever. And Grandelius is another player who also likes to go his own way, as evidenced by the fact that he didn't play, let's say, the current main line of bishop e3, queen f3, and these sort of English attack style approaches. But instead he went for the move g4, like already playing a little bit originally. To which Report decided to just play h6 just to prepare knight f6 without allowing the Keres attack style g5. And white in turn did play bishop e3, and we start to, after all, head back more towards the territory, if you like, of the English attack with a6. But okay, it's an English attack where the moves g4 and h6 have already been inserted as the difference. And it's kind of interesting actually to see that the computer prefers white. It might say that g4 on move 6 might be a quite legitimate try for an advantage against the Taimanov. Now, it didn't stop Report winning the game, so let's see how he did it. Rather than playing some move like knight d4, which is a little bit defensive, black decided to go knight e5 and, try to be annoying like this. And apparently the move h4 is meant to be very strong, with the idea that you basically castle, go rook g1, g5, and just insist on the attack anyway. Now, from a human perspective, it is quite messy. There are moves like d5 where you can try to hit in the center. Computer just doesn't care and says, well, take my pawns, I'm just going to win in the center. But, okay, this is very, very difficult to play and understand without doing a lot of computer preparation beforehand. So I don't really hold it against Grandelius that he didn't find this over the board. But if you're going to prepare this line, it sort of makes sense. You should probably look at this beforehand, like if you are a top, like, 2700 plus player. But anyway, the game went with f4 instead. Going for this pawn sack, knight g4, g5 kind of traps in the knight on g4, right? But f4 is actually a mistake in this position, and funnily enough, neither player managed to find a way to punish it. So if you want to, you could actually put in the comments below what you would play on move 10 in Report's shoes, and see if you can do better than what he did. I mean, I guess at least you know that knight eg4 is not the answer, so that narrows it down a bit. But what black should have done is he should have played bishop to b4, completely ignoring the threat, so that after fe5, knight e4, we just, crash through on c3. It's kind of like danger levels with queen d1, knight takes c3, and yeah, you are sacking a piece. Well, actually, it's not that much of a sack, to be fair, because after bishop takes c3, king f2, bishop a1, queen a1, I mean, one factor is you can take the pawn, but it's actually even better to leave the pawn and just go b5 and, play more for initiative, kick the rook out first. And only then take on e5 at a later moment. Like, let's say rook f1 and queen e5. And yeah, I mean, white's got the bishop pair, but black has, a rook and 3 pawns for the 2 minor pieces, which is way more important at this point. And such that black is probably just winning actually in this position with best play. But okay, neither player saw this idea and instead report played the move knight c4, which probably explains why at some point Grandelius had some advantage, but then he sort of self-destructed at some point where he kind of pushed the envelope a little bit too far. I mean, g5 is a natural move, but the move that he played over e5 is also quite decent. You sack the pawn, but you get some nice lead in development. You get an open g-file to work with. It's definitely not a bad sacrifice here. I went rook to g1. Black plays knight takes e3, takes, and yeah, b5 is a good move. By the way, it's a very common theme in the Taimanov, actually, where black says, yeah, you got your space, like e5, and you can try to do this sort of thing, but reality is that also the d7 pawn is a long way away from white. It's kind of a little bit out of white's arm's reach, yeah? And also that does give black the time to maybe go rook c8, get some queenside counterplay, or even the castle long, which is actually what happened in the game. After king b1, just getting off that b file, allowing you to meet b4 with knight e4 without, dropping the a2 pawn. Probably b4 is actually the best way black should have played it. Kick the knight and then just castle. Your king might look a little bit exposed without the c pawn and the b pawn forward, but once you get to b8, you're somewhat safe actually in that position. So that's what I would have recommended, but report plays to move long castles immediately, which is probably not quite as good for some very concrete reasons. The reason that's given at least by the machine is that knight b3 is quite annoying, going for like knight a5, queen b6, and somehow your king is a bit open and it's not that nice. Whereas the difference here is if white goes knight b3 now, well, okay, you can see that this knight is simply hanging, so a small but actually a very big difference as it turns out. Okay, probably rook e4 is better than queen e4 is better than bishop e4, but you get the idea. Well, instead after this, well, I guess the players didn't realize it, because white goes knight to e4, and, well, it just goes to show you how messy and how complex these time-on positions are. Like, you've obviously got the imbalance with the black being a pawn up, white having the strong knights, black having the bishop pair, but not the development. So, to be fair, it's not an easy position for even the best players in the world to play, right? But king b8 is a good move, and, the players do get back on track here. Rook d8 also a good move to, try and lift the rook into the attack. Rook c8 was played. So all very, very standard by both sides. And probably the way for white to proceed now is to play a3. And the idea of a3 is kind of to hold back b4 a bit, but also to have some ideas like, let's say, if black just doesn't make a move in this position, well, then maybe you can even try a move such as b4 and try to fix the queen side. Although I have to admit it is a position where probably it's not that easy for either side to improve their position. So it's kind of like a3 is like this slightly useful move where you don't show your cards to black is a little bit of the idea. I mean, you never know when like king a2 will be a useful luft down the line, I guess, if black somehow got a piece to the back rank. But instead, Grandelius plays rook g1, g to d1. I mean, I get the idea that he wants to pressure this pawn. It's quite natural, but the issue with it is that you're not pressuring this pawn anymore. Because, like, let's say if black goes g6 trying to go bishop e7 without losing the pawn, well, then you're allowing knight f6 and this becomes a big problem. So this is what I mean about it being very hard for either side to easily improve their position from this point. But after rook gd1, well, now it's different. The black does have the move bishop to e7. Okay, computer says you should go b4 and then bishop e7 is even better, but this, of course, is perfectly okay as well. And the fact that white doesn't see a3 definitely, well, holds him back quite a bit, because after rook c3, black now plays a move queen a4, and, well, if you had to move a3 and you'd have a move like b4 in some positions to try and trap the queen, and here you just don't have that. And white, I guess, kind of doesn't really find a good plan and just somehow self-destructs, which can happen in these positions where you don't know what to do. So rook cd3 was played like already, like if you're moving a rook back and forth, it's kind of admitting that you don't really have a plan in the position. And after bishop takes e4, well, this is kind of a move that might look a little anti-positional at first sight to give up the bishop pair, but it's all about the tactics. If queen takes e4, the queen is undefended and is pinned. And that's the reason why we can just play rook c2 and just gobble the free pawn. And don't play b3, because then queen a2 is checkmate, but otherwise you're down 2 pawns, and for what? I don't know. So white goes b3 first to at least kick that queen out of the way before taking the bishop. But now the king is very weak on the dark squares, yes or yes, and that is also a problem in a way. Again, computer is saying play f5 and g5 and play on the king side. If white takes en passant, it kind of helps activate the bishop, yes or yes. But reports move rook c7, while it's not the engine's first choice, it's still, giving a nice advantage. You defend the pawn and you prepare to bring the final piece into play, which is all good stuff. Probably the best bet for white is, well, like the line that the computer gives here is very, very difficult. It's to play the move of c3, with the idea you're going to kind of in some moment maybe go knight e2 or even b4, but again, it's very, very hard to play because not only do you have to realize that c3, b4 is the right plan to undermine, like, to sort of limit the opponent's counterplay on the queen side, but you also have to realize that rook c3 is not just a free pawn grab because of this very difficult tactic, knight e6. And the point is that, you're going for rook d7, so say take, d6, and then with rook d7, white gets the piece back. And even though white's down a pawn, I mean, the king is at least a little bit open, and this is this factor that basically allows white to survive at this point. But okay, it's very tricky. Like, you also have to have nerves of steel to realize that, that if rook d8, that you're not just getting mated, but, that after queen h1, you are somehow surviving. Like, this is very, very difficult. Like, I would really think that only, like, probably a top 5 player in the world, I think, would have any realistic hope of seeing all of this without kind of knowing that this sort of possibility exists in the position, as it were. But anyway, white played f5, and yeah, it's kind of a bit self-destructive in the end. Black just goes rook h8, and, what did f5 really achieve in a way? So white goes rook g3. I mean, maybe there was a time trouble as a factor as well at this point, maybe, but Report continues to play good moves, realizing at rook g7, queen c3 is just basically mate. So now black is essentially up a pawn, but he also has the initiative as well. h4, queen b4. Not the first choice of the engine, but still a pretty good idea to pin like this. h5, now rook c3, preparing to get that rook in to try to support this. Actually, it turns out technically rook c3 is a mistake, that actually there was a very nice transformation of the position that was possible here in the form of the move rook takes c2. Not the first time we've seen this pinning idea, right? But the point is, after rook queen c2, that at first it might look like, with the fork and with this, that white is somehow staying in the game. But computer points out, very nice move. I was lost my voice there. About queen f4 attacking the rook and not giving white that time to coordinate. So if rook g7, queen f5, then, the pin stops them taking your bishop, which is very, very important here. Also very important that rook d7, you've got queen f1 for back rank mate concepts. Or if they play rook gd3 trying to keep coordination, well then they're just a bit short on pawns. And it turns out that, after take, that the two rooks just don't lead to a mate in this position. Or actually, maybe that's not true. Like, rook 1d6 might actually save the game for white. So yeah, it's still very, very difficult. But yeah, you can play queen e5. This is what happens when you rely too much on the computer. When you misread it, you don't pick it up at first. But yeah, here it's important that, you've got the, the fact that, you're able to kind of, always be able to, like, take with and trade the queen for two rooks if they just check you ad infinitum is obviously quite important, yeah? Or I guess also the fact you can run this way and, don't have rook d5 check at the end because the pawn is covering it. It's little things like that that make all the difference. But black goes rook to c3. And I guess in the time scramble, white didn't realize that you have to throw in the move fe6 at this point, which of course requires you to realize that black is not actually threatening to take the rook, because ed7 and, you're threatening this and you're threatening this and you're threatening this, and so it means that white would be winning in this case. Meaning that black would basically have to take back, but then after this, we're going to see that it makes a world of difference to have this compared to in the game, when you have rook d7 and actually a threatening queen h7 mate. If you get that in, it just makes a world of difference. But instead, white plays rook g7 immediately, and unfortunately this comparison is, well, it's quite a big difference basically. And that is that here, black has one winning move, and Report managed to find it. It's a move rook to h3. Where in this way we clear the way for queen to c3, but we do it without allowing a rook to come back to the defense. If rook d3, then, rook h1 is back rank mate, yes or yes. If white plays a move, well, he can't really move the knight easily because the queen would be hanging. So white in the game tries queen to e1, but Report just finds a very beautiful move to finish the game. And that move is rook to h1. Because queen here, rook d1 is mate, right? But if you play the move rook g1 or queen takes h1, it'll be the same story. But in the game, white went rook g1, and after take, queen to c3, there is no defense to queen b2 mate in a matter of moves. And for this reason, Grandelius resigned, and Report secured the win. Yeah, this was a really fun game to conclude. Like, this was super complex and definitely, it's a sort of game I think that, yeah, even the very best players in the world would probably learn something from, from going through the analysis of this game, because it was a very difficult position for both sides to play, and, that's sometimes how it goes with these less common openings. So, it's harder for black, but it's also sometimes harder for white in terms of not, like, having a whole blanket of fury to follow for, like, 30 moves or whatever. But anyway, that's the conclusion of the recap. We actually got through all of the Tata Steel 2022 Masters games for this round by some miracle. Like I said, the next video, I will do a later video, I will recap round 3 and round 4 of the Challengers event. It's just going to work better that way to do it on the rest day, because otherwise this video is 2.5 hours long, and well, even I would struggle to get through a 2.5 hours video without a break. So in any case, well, congratulations if you have completed the full video. I know you are the most loyal supporters if you watch it all the way to the end, so congrats. And well, I would like to know also in the comments, yeah, what was your favorite game that we looked at from round 3 of Tata Steel? And if you are rated over 2,000, you're always welcome to DM me on the next steps in getting the master. Offer is always there. And I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.